Have you ever had one of those days where you wake up and you just feel um, utterly and inexplicably drained of energy?
Oh, yeah. Like you haven't even done anything yet.
Exactly. Like your feet have barely hit the floor, but your tank is already just completely on empty. Or, maybe you've caught yourself acting completely impulsively, giving in to some bizarre craving, or snapping at someone you love, almost as if someone or something else was temporarily steering the ship of your own mind.
It is a deeply unsettling feeling, that sudden kind of cold realization that you might not actually be the only one making the decisions in your own body.
Right.
We really love to think of ourselves as these, impenetrable sovereign fortresses of free will, but the biological and psychological reality is just much, much more porous.
Yeah, and when we talk about losing control or feeling that crushing fatigue, we almost always look for a clean binary explanation, right? Like, oh, you didn't sleep enough or you're stressed at your job.
Or you ate too much sugar.
Right, exactly. It's safe and it's controllable. But today, we are stepping into a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky and just utterly fascinating. We are tracing an unbelievable historical thread for this deep dive.
And it spans a massive amount of time.
It really does. We're going from ancient desert exorcisms all the way to modern molecular biology to figure out why the language of demonic possession is practically identical to the science of parasitic infection.
And I think it's important to note this isn't just an abstract history lesson about, people in the Middle Ages. We are looking at a fundamental, ongoing human struggle here.
Yeah.
How do we categorize the invisible things that invade us, that consume our resources, and actually alter our behavior? Because when you place the historical record right next to cutting-edge empirical science, the overlap in how we describe these entities is just, it's staggering.
It really is. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that exact evolution using a massive stack of sources. We've got historical dissertation archives on early modern science, medical texts, theological forums, and modern biological studies.
It's a lot of material.
It's a ton. We're going to unpack how early magical and religious beliefs about these invisible tormentors transformed into the empirical science of parasitology. And we'll explore the massive paradigm shifts brought on by the Enlightenment and the invention of the microscope.
Right, which completely changed the game.
Totally. And finally, we'll look at why, even today, some communities are kind of reverting back to that ancient spiritual language to describe biological illnesses.
Well, I think we really have to start by looking at the core definitions from our sources. So, biologically speaking, a parasite is an organism that lives on or in a host organism.
Right, it's a freeloader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It survives by stealing nutrients at the host's expense. Now, sometimes it's a complete hijacking, taking everything until the host literally dies. But sometimes it's more insidious, just taking a continuous cut of the metabolic profit so it can survive long-term without killing the host.
Okay, now contrast that with the classical theological definition of a demon. A demon is described as an evil spirit or entity, specifically one that possesses a person to act as a tormentor, right?
Yes.
It's an invisible entity that infests a human host. So notice the striking overlap here. Both operate completely undetected.
Yeah.
They slip in under the radar of your immune system or, your spiritual defenses, and fundamentally both are thieves.
They are. They are agents of consumption. The biological parasite drains your physical nutrients, which creates this cascade of chronic fatigue, brain fog, and severe metabolic disruption.
Right.
And the demon, according to millennia of spiritual traditions, drains your spiritual energy. It feeds on fear, anxiety, and despair. But the truly terrifying part isn't just the theft of energy, it's the manipulation.
Oh, this is the craziest part to me.
Yeah, they don't just passively feed. They actively re-engineer the host's behavior to ensure their own survival.
Let's dig into that manipulation, because
Right.
nature is just full of horrifying examples of this. The classic one, of course, is Toxoplasma gondii. And this isn't just some rare exotic bug. This is a parasite that infects a massive percentage of the global human population.
Yeah, Toxoplasma gondii is a masterpiece of biological hijacking. It's just a microscopic, single-celled parasite. But its life cycle is highly specific. It can only sexually reproduce inside the intestinal tract of a feline, usually a house cat.
Right, so it has to get into a cat somehow.
Exactly. And its intermediate hosts are often rodents, like mice. Now, a healthy, uninfected mouse has a deeply ingrained evolutionary terror of cats. The mere scent of cat urine will send a mouse into an absolute panic.
It triggers the amygdala, right?
Yes, it triggers the amygdala and forces it to flee. Basic survival instinct.
Avoid the predator at all costs. But when the mouse ingests this parasite, the script flips entirely.
Completely flips. The parasite actually migrates into the mouse's brain and forms these tiny cysts, and then it begins to physically rewire the rodent's neurochemistry.
Which is just mind-blowing.
It really is. It suppresses the fear response in the amygdala, and it hijacks the dopamine reward pathways. So it actually alters the brain so that the mouse becomes sexually aroused by the scent of cat urine.
Which, for a mouse, is a spectacularly bad survival strategy. I mean, it's basically suicide.
It's a fatal strategy. The mouse actively seeks out the cat easily catches and eats the fearless mouse, and the parasite successfully reaches the cat's gut to reproduce.
Wow.
The parasite has literally reached into the control panel of the host's brain, overridden its most ancient survival instinct, and driven it toward guaranteed destruction, purely for its own benefit.
And it's not just mice and cats. You see this everywhere in the biological world. I mean, our sources mention zombie snails.
Oh, those are terrifying.
Right. Where a parasitic flatworm infects a snail, takes over its motor functions, and forces it to climb up to the highest, most exposed leaves in broad daylight. Snails naturally hate daylight. They want to hide in the dark, damp spots.
Yeah, they want to stay hidden.
But the worm forces it into the open and then makes the snail's eye stalks pulse with these vibrant neon colors, so a bird will spot it, rip its eyes off, and eat it, which continues the worm's life cycle. You have zombie cicadas infected by mind-controlling fungi. You have zombie deer.
It's a recurring theme in nature.
These tiny physical entities are stripping away the host's autonomy.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable question. If a single-celled organism can completely override the free will of a complex mammal like a mouse, what are these entities doing to human beings?
Right, because, I mean, we aren't immune to Toxoplasma gondii. We get it from undercooked meat or, cleaning out a cat's litter box. And the psychological and metabolic links in humans are wild.
They are profound. Modern biological studies are drawing direct lines between parasitic infections and the resulting disruption of the gut microbiome to severe psychological conditions.
Really? Like what?
Well, we are seeing higher rates of Toxoplasma antibodies in patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. We see correlations with erratic, risk-taking behavior, sudden bursts of aggression, and even deep, unexplainable depression.
I was reading in the sources about how this disruption even bleeds into our sleep. When your gut biome is hijacked by a parasite, the resulting metabolic distress can influence the dream realm.
Oh, absolutely.
It's been linked to an increase in night terrors, and potentially even the manifestation of those terrifying shadow beings people report seeing during sleep paralysis.
Yeah, the sleep paralysis connection is fascinating.
It's like your brain is trying to interpret the massive chemical alarm bells ringing in your gut, and it projects that internal invader as an external monster standing in the corner of your room.
It's an incredible synthesis of the metabolic and the psychological. The vagus nerve acts as this massive information superhighway between the gut and the brain. If a parasite is irritating the gut lining, it is sending frantic, chaotic signals up that highway. Furthermore, parasites need specific fuels to survive, often simple sugars and highly processed carbohydrates.
So wait, when I suddenly have this overwhelming midnight craving for a giant bowl of sugary cereal.
It might not actually be you who wants it.
Oh my gosh.
Biological parasites can induce intense metabolic cravings by manipulating your neurotransmitters. They make you crave the exact foods they need to rapidly reproduce. You think you are just having a moment of weakness, a failure of willpower.
Right, like I just have a sweet tooth today.
Exactly. But anatomically and biologically, you are being chemically puppeted by a foreign organism. Just as a traditional demon is said to tempt you into gluttony or destructive habits, the parasite literally alters your neurochemistry to force your compliance.
It almost feels like we need a new vocabulary to talk about this, because the line between psychology, biology, and even physics gets really blurry here. I was thinking about this almost from a quantum physics standpoint.
Oh, that's an interesting angle. How so?
Well, conceptually, think about quantum mechanics. You have the observer effect, right?
Right, where an unobserved system exists in a state of probability, a wave function.
Exactly. But the mere act of an observer interacting with that quantum system forces it to collapse into a definite state.
It forces a physical reality.
Yes. And in a weird way, these microscopic parasites are like these invisible quantum variables. You can't see them, you can't feel them directly, but the moment they interact with your biological system, the moment they quote-unquote observe and engage with your cellular receptors, your entire macro reality collapses into a new state.
Oh, wow.
Your mood changes, your behavior changes. The invisible forces the physical to manifest in a highly specific, often destructive way.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The invisible sublayer of reality dictates the macro behavior of the organism. And this invisible hijacking is exactly why cognitive scientists, who are, traditionally very secular and completely resist anything metaphysical, are starting to adopt language that sounds suspiciously ancient.
What do you mean? Like what kind of language?
In certain psychological frameworks today, therapists and cognitive scientists are using the term parasitic processes to describe debilitating, energy-draining mental constructs.
Parasitic processes.
Right. If someone is suffering from severe obsessive-compulsive loops or a deeply entrenched addiction, psychologists will describe these thought patterns as entities that fall upon the individual, debilitate them, and draw metabolic and psychological energy from the host in order to expand their own influence in the brain.
Wait, so they're describing a thought pattern as if it has its own biological agency.
Exactly. They describe these dark psychological loops as almost having a mind of their own. They use incredibly nuanced, secular, clinical language to describe a behavioral phenomenon that ancient texts and historical figures straight up called a demon.
Okay, that changes everything. Because if modern empirical science is proving that tiny, invisible physical invaders, and even these parasitic thought processes, can literally control our minds, alter our neurochemistry, and make us self-destructive, it completely reframes how we read ancient religious and medical texts.
It really does.
Let's step back in time. Because when you view our ancestors through this lens, they don't sound crazy or primitive at all. They sound hyper-observant.
They were deeply empirical in their own way. They were just working without the benefit of microscopic lenses. If we dive into ancient cross-cultural texts, the conflation of the physical worm and the spiritual demon is totally explicit.
Right.
Take the Essene Gospel of Peace, which is an ancient text detailing early Christian traditions.
Yes. There is this incredible scene described there. Jesus has brought a man who is severely emaciated, sick, and dying. And Jesus is described as casting an entity out of the sick man. But the text doesn't just say he magically banished a ghost. It explicitly identifies the entity as Satan, but describes it physically as a worm as long as a man.
Which, anatomically speaking, is entirely possible for a human tapeworm. They can grow to be 20 or 30 feet long inside the human digestive tract.
Just imagine being a villager watching that.
Yeah.
A man is wasting away, seemingly possessed by a spirit of death, and then he expels a 30-foot-long, moving, undulating monster from his bowels. And the absolute shock and horror of that, of course, they called it Satan. I mean, what else could it be?
And pay attention to the treatment prescribed in that text. Jesus doesn't just pray over the man, he instructs him to fast.
Oh, that's right.
He tells the man to fast and pray, because when you fast, you starve Satan, and eventually the entity is forced to exit the body to seek sustenance elsewhere.
That is brilliant. The theological cure of fasting is identical to the biological mechanism of starving a gut parasite. The spiritual discipline is simultaneously a highly effective physical medical treatment. You are changing the metabolic environment of the gut so the parasite can no longer survive.
It's a perfect overlap, and we see this conflation of the spiritual and the physical throughout ancient texts. Let's look at the fiery serpents mentioned in the book of Numbers in the Bible.
Right, so the Israelites are wandering in the desert, they complain against God, and they are punished with a plague of fiery serpents that bite the people, causing many to die. For centuries, people read this purely as a metaphorical or divine punishment like mythological fire-breathing snakes.
But historical epidemiologists and biologists look at the geographic region and the symptoms described, and they point to a very specific physical reality. Tricunculus midinensis, commonly known as the guinea worm.
Oh man, the guinea worm. Just understanding the life cycle of this thing makes my skin crawl.
It is a truly horrific affliction. Humans contract the guinea worm by drinking contaminated, stagnant water containing microscopic water fleas that are infected with the worm larvae.
Okay.
Once ingested, the larvae penetrate the stomach wall and migrate through the body's tissues. They mate, the males die, and the females grow. They can grow up to 3 feet long inside the human body, migrating right through the subcutaneous tissues.
You have no idea it's happening.
Yeah.
Not until it's time for the worm to reproduce.
Correct. About a year after infection, the female worm needs to release her eggs back into a water source. So to do this, she secretes an acid that creates an incredibly painful burning blister on the host's skin, usually on the lower leg or foot.
Ouch.
The burning sensation is so intensely agonizing that the afflicted person is driven nearly mad with the pain, and their immediate, desperate instinct is to run to a river or a pond to cool their burning limb in the water.
Which is exactly what the worm wants.
Mhm.
As soon as the blister hits the cool water, it bursts, and the worm ejects millions of larvae back into the drinking supply, completing its life cycle. It is a biological fire, the fiery serpent.
And the worst part is you can't just grab the worm and yank it out once it emerges.
No, because if you pull it, the worm's body snaps.
Mhm.
The front half comes out, but the remaining 2 feet of the worm retracts deep into your muscle tissue, dies, and begins to putrefy. You end up with a massive, often fatal, secondary bacterial infection. Your leg literally rots from the inside out.
So, the ancient healers developed a highly specific extraction method. When the head of the worm emerges from the blister, you carefully catch it and you tie it to a small stick.
Right.
Then, very, very slowly, maybe just a centimeter a day, over the course of a week or two, you wind the worm around the stick, turn by turn. You maintain constant tension without breaking it.
Which brings us to one of the most mind-blowing historical connections in this whole deep dive. This slow extraction method, a serpent winding around a wooden staff, is widely believed to be the historical origin of the caduceus,
Yeah.
or the rod of Asclepius.
Exactly.
The universal symbol of medicine that we still use today,
Yeah.
the one you see on ambulances and pharmacies. It isn't just abstract Greek mythology. It is a literal ancient instructional diagram for how to perform a parasite extraction.
It is a stunning example of how ancient medicine, mythology, and biology were deeply, deeply intertwined. And this isn't isolated to the Middle East either. If we look cross-culturally, we see the exact same patterns. On the Indian subcontinent, Vedic literature and Ayurvedic texts discuss entities called nagas.
Nagas are usually depicted as these serpentine, semi-divine beings.
Yes. And what is one of their primary functions in ancient Hindu culture? They are revered as the fierce protectors of drinking water. They guard the wells and the rivers from corruption.
Ah, I see where this is going.
The ancient people understood, through observation, that stagnant or corrupt water led to serpentine diseases, parasites. So they created a spiritual framework to enforce hygiene and protect the water sources.
That makes total sense. And in traditional Chinese medicine, you have the legendary physician Sun Simiao, writing around the 7th century. He systematically cataloged the 9 worms that afflict the human body.
He was incredibly thorough.
But he didn't just view them as biological infections like a modern doctor would. They were viewed as physical manifestations of a bodily imbalance, yes, but also as semi-demonic harbingers of death. They were physical creatures that possessed a demonic resonance.
We even see this blending of the physical and supernatural in the Americas, particularly within traditional African-American hoodoo practices. In these traditions, physical parasites often metonymically blended with spiritual curses.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, if someone believed they were hexed or cursed, the physical manifestation of that spiritual attack might be a bodily infestation.
And the treatment for that was fascinating from the sources. A hoodoo practitioner might use cupping horns, which, is a legitimate medical practice of creating a vacuum on the skin to draw blood to the surface. But they would use it to dramatically draw out what they believed were supernatural spiders, lizards, or snakes.
Right.
They would pull these entities out and immediately drop them into plates of salt to kill them.
Because salt dehydrates and kills physical slugs and worms, and by extension, it neutralizes supernatural corruption.
I want to pause here for a second and just ask you, the person listening to this right now, to put yourself in the shoes of someone living 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Long before the invention of the microscope, long before germ theory. You have no concept of microscopic eggs or cellular biology.
Not at all.
And one day, after weeks of feeling weak, crazy, and in pain, you suddenly expel a horrifying, moving, 3-foot-long creature from your body. A creature you had absolutely no idea was living inside you.
Yeah.
Isn't it entirely logical, deeply rational, and scientifically sound based on your available data to classify that entity as a literal demon?
It is the absolute most rational conclusion available to the ancient mind. They observed an invisible force causing immense suffering, altering the host's behavior, and occasionally manifesting as a monstrous physical entity that forcibly exited the body. Calling it a demon wasn't an act of primitive ignorance. It was their framework for categorizing a hostile, invasive agency that violated the boundaries of the human body.
So this perfectly logical leap defined human medicine for centuries. They lived in a reality where the medical, the religious, and the symbolic were not separate disciplines at all. They were a single blended reality.
Yes.
So if we jump forward to the Middle Ages, how did the early modern scholars, the medieval medical mind, attempt to treat an illness that was simultaneously a physical worm and a spiritual corruption?
Well, to understand medieval medicine, we have to understand the prevailing scientific theory of the time, which was rooted in humoral theory and a concept known as spontaneous generation. We can look at figures like Gilbert the Englishman, a very prominent physician practicing around the year 1200.
Okay, let's unpack humoral theory because it's kind of the key to all of this. The belief was that the human body was governed by four vital fluids, or humors:
Ah,
blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm.
right.
Health was simply the perfect balance of these four fluids, and illness was an imbalance.
Exactly. And because they couldn't see microscopic parasite eggs on unwashed vegetables or in undercooked pork, they had no concept of external transmission.
Right, they couldn't see the microscopic vectors.
They didn't understand that a worm entered from the outside. Therefore, they deduced that the worm must be created from the inside. This is spontaneous generation.
The idea that life can just spontaneously spring into existence from dead or decaying matter,
Yeah.
like maggots appearing on rotting meat. They didn't know flies laid invisible eggs. They thought the rotting meat literally turned into maggots.
Precisely. So, applying that logic to the human body, early modern scholars like Gilbert the Englishman and his contemporaries wrote that worms were spontaneously engendered in a man's guts when those organs contained an excess of corrupt, putrefying humors, specifically an excess of phlegm.
And how did you get an excess of putrefying phlegm?
Hmm?
By eating the wrong foods, eating cold and damp foods, or simply through gluttony, overeating.
Which perfectly closes the loop between physical disease and moral failing. The moral failing of gluttony causes a physical imbalance of humors. The humors putrefy, and that putrefaction spontaneously generates a living worm. The worm is literally born from your sin. It is the symptom of your internal moral corruption, not an external invader you caught by accident.
That is wild. And because they believed these worms spawned directly from corrupt matter, they firmly believed worms could spontaneously generate anywhere in the body where corruption pooled. They were not limited to the digestive tract. This led to some truly bizarre and highly specific classifications of parasitic infestations.
The most famous of which is the toothworm.
I am obsessed with the toothworm. For centuries, people across Europe and Asia believed that toothaches and dental cavities were caused by literal tiny worms living inside the tooth. They believed the worm was physically gnawing on the dentin and the nerve from the inside out.
And their treatment for the toothworm was completely aligned with this belief. They would attempt to smoke the worm out. A medieval dentist would use burning henbane seeds or chamomile and use a funnel to direct the bitter smoke directly into the patient's mouth, right onto the cavity.
Like fumigating a house.
Exactly. The logic was just like smoking an animal out of a burrow. The bitter smoke would drive the worm to abandon the tooth.
But here's the crazy part. The treatment actually kind of worked, which only reinforced the bad science.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Henbane is a member of the nightshade family. It contains powerful alkaloids that have hallucinogenic and critically anesthetic properties. So when you blow henbane smoke into a cavity, it numbs the dental nerve. The pain stops. The patient thinks, wow, the worm is dead. The treatment was a success. They were getting positive clinical results from a completely flawed premise.
That is the ultimate danger of empirical observation without a complete understanding of the underlying mechanics. We see this again with another medieval diagnosis, the earworm.
Today, if I say earworm, you think of a catchy pop song you can't get out of your head.
Hmm.
But to a 13th century doctor, an earworm was a physical nightmare.
It was. Patients would present with intense itching, tingling, or pain deep in the ear canal. Gilbert the Englishman theorized this was a spontaneously generated worm, and his specific medical treatment was to take a warm, heavily ripened, sweet-smelling apple and instruct the patient to sleep with it resting against their affected ear overnight.
The idea being that the worm, drawn by the warmth and the intoxicating smell of rotting fruit, would crawl out of the ear canal during the night. And in the morning, you would supposedly find the worm resting in the core of the apple.
It sounds absurd to modern ears, but it highlights the logical framework they were operating within.
I actually want to push back against the modern tendency to laugh at this. It's so easy for us in the 21st century, sitting here with our antibiotics and MRI machines, to look back at Gilbert the Englishman and say, look at these ignorant peasants putting apples on their pillows. But if you strip away the bad premise, the methodology is brilliant. Leaving a warm apple next to an ear is a highly empirical, logical, trial and error scientific method. If your hypothesis is that there is a bug in the ear and your biological data tells you that bugs are attracted to warm, sweet, rotting fruit, then setting a baited trap is genius. They were doing good science. They were just doing it with fundamentally flawed data.
You're absolutely right. They were deeply observant and highly systematic. They categorized diseases, documented symptoms, and standardized treatments. But their foundational societal view during the medieval period was that worms were the result of disease, a byproduct of moral and physical decay, not the initial cause of the disease. The worm was the symptom of your internal corruption.
So to move from leaving apples on pillows to true empirical parasitology, to understanding that the worm was the invader, not the symptom, required a massive technological leap.
Yeah.
A leap that would finally shatter the illusion of spontaneous generation and decouple the physical worm from moral sin.
And that technological leap was the invention and refinement of the compound microscope. This takes us into a pivotal era of medical history, spanning roughly from 1650 to 1810, which we see heavily documented in the historical dissertation archives. This is the Enlightenment era, where magic, myth, and humoral theory begin to slowly and often painfully yield to structured empirical science.
The watershed moment here is 1665, with the publication of Robert Hume's masterpiece, Micrographia.
Micrographia changed the human perspective of reality forever. Hooke used an early compound microscope to look at everyday objects, cork, a flea, a louse, and he drew them in stunning, terrifying detail. Suddenly, the invisible world became visible.
And they were complex.
Exactly. What Hooke and his contemporaries revealed was that these tiny insects and worms weren't just shapeless blobs of corrupt phlegm, they were intricate, perfectly designed machines. They had articulated joints, complex eyes, and terrifying mandibles.
Around the same time, you have Athanasius Kircher, a brilliant Jesuit scholar. He took early microscopes and started examining the blood of plague victims. He reported seeing countless worms, imperceptible to the naked eye, writhing in the blood.
Now, his microscopes probably weren't powerful enough to see the actual plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis. He was likely seeing red blood cells or larger microbes.
Right, but his core hypothesis was revolutionary. He argued that these tiny, invisible entities were the active agents responsible for transmitting the disease.
There was a massive conceptual shift, but the fatal blow to the supernatural spontaneous generation theory came a bit later, in the late 17th century, from an Italian physician named Giovan Cosimo Bonomo.
Bonomo's work is the linchpin. He focused on scabies. Scabies is a horrific skin condition that causes relentless, maddening itching and blistering. For centuries, following humoral theory, scabies was blamed on melancholy humors, corrupting the blood and bubbling up to the skin.
But Bonomo did something unprecedented. He extracted the fluid from a scabies blister, placed it under a microscope, and observed the biological reality. He proved that scabies was caused by a tiny physical mite tunneling under the skin. But he didn't just stop at identifying the mite. Crucially, vitally, Bonomo observed the mite laying eggs.
Boom. That is the paradigm shift right there. The egg changes everything.
It changes everything because if the mite lays eggs, it does not spontaneously generate from corrupt human flesh. It reproduces, it has a lineage. It is a biological entity that exists independent of the human host, and it enters from the outside.
Oh, yeah.
It proved that disease could be transmitted by microscopic organisms passing from person to person. You didn't get scabies because you were a sinner. You got scabies because a mite walked onto your arm.
But even with this undeniable microscopic proof, the transition wasn't instantaneous. It's not like the medical community looked through the lens and suddenly had modern biology figured out. Human psychology is incredibly stubborn, and old fears die hard. As we move into the 18th century, we see this struggle perfectly embodied in the work of Nicholas André.
Nicholas André is a fascinating Enlightenment figure. He is famous today for coining the term orthopedics, but his true obsession was worms. In 1700, he published a massive treatise attempting to empirically classify all these newly discovered microscopic worm species. He was trying to sort them botanically and zoologically, trying to bring order to the chaos of the microscopic world.
But his work highlights how difficult early scientific observation actually was.
Mm.
The lenses were imperfect, prone to chromatic aberration. The lighting was literally just candlelight or sunlight focused through a water globe. And above all, human imagination is a powerful filter. We see what we expect to see.
And what did Enlightenment doctors expect to see when they looked at parasites? Demons. The historical archives note that some doctors, including Andrew himself at times, claimed that worms inside humans could mutate into monstrous shapes as they grew older.
Wait, really?
Yes, they were looking at these tiny biological specimens and claiming they took on the shapes of frogs, scorpions, or lizards with forked tails.
They were experiencing microscopic pareidolia. They were literally projecting the classic medieval imagery of demons, horned beasts, forked tails, monstrous hybrids directly onto the microscopic slides. The physical worm was visible, but the cultural terror of the demonic invader was still acting as the lens.
Which is why the development of precise scientific illustration was so critical. The historical dissertation archives emphasize that early illustrations, like the elaborate copper plate engravings in Andrew's books, acted as virtual specimens.
Explain how a drawing functions as a virtual specimen.
Before the printing press and accurate engravings, if a doctor in Italy found a strange worm in a patient, he could only write a text description. But text is subjective. One man's hideous monster is another man's small thread. But with detailed, scaled engravings, a doctor in Paris could share an exact, objective visual representation with a doctor in London.
Oh, that makes sense.
They could compare notes, they could establish taxonomies, they categorized these creatures just like they were categorizing newly discovered plants from the Americas.
So the act of drawing it, naming it in Latin, and putting it in the classification table slowly stripped away its supernatural power. These illustrations replaced the existential fear of a shapeless, spiritual demon with a structured, physical, manageable disease classification. If you can categorize it, you demystify it.
Exactly. But identifying the biological enemy and naming it was only half the battle. Once you knew the worm was a physical invader, you still had to get it out of the body. And let me tell you, the empirical medical treatments of the Enlightenment era were often just as wild and arguably much more violent than the magical remedies of the Middle Ages.
The 18th century medical interventions were absolutely brutal. The prevailing medical theory, blending new mechanics with old humoral ideas, was that worms thrived in mucilage, excessive heat and dampness in the gut. So the first line of defense was preventative lifestyle management. You altered your diet to avoid creating a swampy environment in your stomach.
But if prevention failed and the worms got in, you had to purge them. The Enlightenment medical texts list out these aggressive treatments, relying heavily on potent, often toxic purgative plants. They used botanicals like wormwood and gentian root.
These are incredibly bitter, harsh substances. The goal wasn't gentle healing. The goal was chemical warfare. You basically poison the environment of the gut to make it uninhabitable for the worm, and then provoked a massive, violent bout of vomiting and diarrhea to flush the dead or dying entities out of the system.
And this era also saw the explosion of patent medicines and famous apothecary remedies. The archives mention commercial products like Peter's Sovereign Remedy for the Worms, or Pulvis Benedictus, which translates to the Blessed Powder. These were marketed fiercely to the public as cure-alls.
And the ingredients in these blessed powders were terrifying. Medical texts from the period mention prescribing pills made of common mercury mixed with leaf gold. You are instructing a patient to ingest heavy metals. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, severe abdominal pain, kidney failure, and neurological damage.
The rationale was that the heavy, toxic nature of mercury would literally crush and poison the worms, driving them downward and out of the bowels.
I look at these extreme, violent, Enlightenment-era chemical purges, and it feels exactly like a physical, biological form of an exorcism. You are subjecting the human host body to absolute torment vomiting, diarrhea, toxic shock, heavy metal poisoning, in the desperate hope that the internal environment becomes so hostile, so agonizing, that the demon or the worm is forced to flee. You really have to ask if the enlightened cure wasn't frequently worse than the ancient disease.
It was a brutal, mechanistic form of medicine that treated the body as a battlefield. And it's fascinating to contrast these aggressive chemical purges with older homeopathic or magical remedies that were still circulating at the time. For instance, if you look at the Chinese Materia Medica, there are prescriptions that operate on a completely different philosophical logic.
I remember reading one specific remedy for an inflamed, infected eyelid, which was likely caused by a parasite. It is the ultimate expression of the corrupting the corruptors philosophy.
Right. The medical prescription was to take a physical roundworm that had been vomited up by a sick child. You take that worm, dry it out in the sun, grind it into a fine powder, mix it with water to form a paste, and then apply that paste directly to the patient's inflamed eye.
Which sounds completely unsanitary and horrific to us. But the logic is impeccable if you follow their framework. It's the ultimate hair of the dog. The philosophical idea was that the biological agent of corruption, the worm, could be inverted. By destroying it, grinding it up, and applying it, you were using the essence of the disease as the cure. You were fighting fire with fire.
It is deeply symbolic medicine. But this historical desire, this primal, desperate human need for a magic bullet to violently purge our inner demons, whether you use toxic mercury, bitter wormwood, or a paste of dried roundworms, this brings us right back to the present day. Because this exact debate, this intense conflation of the spiritual exorcism and the physical purge, is currently raging in modern 21st century forums.
It is. And as we transition into looking at this modern phenomenon, we have to frame this carefully for our listeners. We're examining these contemporary sources with strict objectivity. We aren't endorsing or condemning the use of alternative medicines or specific pharmaceutical protocols. We're looking at the sociological and theological phenomenon of this belief system based on the texts and forum posts provided in our research stack.
That's a crucial distinction, because what we are seeing online is a rapidly growing movement that argues that many modern, intractable human problems, chronic fatigue, severe depression, debilitating anxiety, and even erratic, immoral behavior, are not merely psychological or chemical imbalances. They are arguing that these afflictions are literally caused by demons, and that these demons exist in the physical, biological form of intestinal parasites.
It's a complete full-circle moment back to the Essene gospel in the medieval mind. The modern theory posits that by taking powerful physical dewormers, the sources specifically cite drugs like ivermectin or fenbendazole, you can cure these spiritual ailments. People in these forums are claiming that they take an antiparasitic medication, they expel biological parasites into the toilet, and magically their lifelong depression vanishes.
Right.
Their crushing anxiety disappears. Their intrusive dark thoughts are silenced.
They are providing subjective anecdotal evidence that a chemical purge of a physical entity results in a profound spiritual and psychological liberation. They quote people saying things like, "Parasites are literal demons." They argue that society is plagued by mental illness and moral decay simply because we are suffering from an undetected, mass demonic parasitic infestation.
Wow.
And they point directly to the ancient texts we just discussed. Jesus casting out the worm, the ancient traditions of fasting, as historical proof that the ancients always knew demons were physical bugs.
But our sources also capture a very strong, very vocal theological and philosophical pushback against this modern internet theory. The theological counterargument relies heavily on classical scripture, specifically pointing to passages like Ephesians 6:11, which states, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places."
The theological pushback argues that demons, by definition, belong to a spiritual hierarchy. They are immaterial. If you can put it under a microscope, if it has DNA, if it reproduces by laying eggs, then it is flesh and blood, which means it is fundamentally not the spiritual enemy the Apostle Paul was talking about. It is just a bug.
And the sources point out the immense philosophical danger of conflating the two.
This is where we need to really synthesize this tension, because the implications for how we view humanity and morality are profound. Let's look at the danger from both sides of the coin. On one hand, if a parasite is literally a demon, it implies a terrifyingly mechanistic view of the soul. It implies that you can cure deep spiritual or moral failings with a pharmaceutical pill.
Which completely obliterates the concept of human agency and personal accountability. If my habit of lying to my family or my crippling addiction or my sudden bursts of cruelty are just caused by a nematode in my lower intestine, then I don't need to repent. I don't need to go to therapy, I don't need to seek forgiveness, and I don't need to do the incredibly hard, painful work of personal growth. I just need to swallow a dewormer. It removes free will, and it reduces the complexity of the human soul to a basic chemical equation.
Precisely. It is an easy out. It abdicates moral responsibility. But then look at the inverse danger, which is equally damaging. If we firmly equate biological parasites with demonic entities, what happens when an innocent person accidentally ingests a parasite? Say you are an avid gardener working in the soil, or you go swimming in a beautiful freshwater lake on vacation, or stray dog licks your face and you contract a physical parasite from unwashed hands.
If the community belief is that parasites are demons, then your friends and family look at your physical sickness and say, "What hidden sin did you commit to invite a demon into your life?"
Yes.
It creates a horrific, toxic stigma around basic biological illness. Every time you get a stomach bug, you are accused of idolatry or moral failure or spiritual weakness.
It drags us immediately back into the darkest aspects of the medieval mindset, where illness was viewed as a direct divine punishment for sin. The modern theological sources argue that we must maintain a boundary between the physical and the spiritual. Now, to be fair, the metaphor is incredibly potent. And physiologically, it is absolutely true that physically fasting or detoxing a parasite will often yield profound mental clarity and relieve anxiety, simply because you are healing the physical gut-brain axis and stopping the inflammatory response.
Your body isn't screaming in pain anymore, so your mind clears up.
Exactly. But treating complex spiritual, moral, and psychological issues purely as physical bugs is dangerously reductive.
It's the ultimate desire for a quick fix for the tragedy of the human condition. We want the X-ray. We want the clear, jagged white line on the bone that says, here is the break. We want to be able to point at a physical tapeworm in the toilet and say, there it is. There is all my sadness, all my anger, all my bad decisions, all my failed relationships. I flushed it away.
Yeah.
But the human soul, the human mind, and our moral responsibilities are vastly, infinitely more complex than a biological infection.
They are. The narrative arc we've traced today is truly extraordinary. We started with the ancient terror of the toothworm and the fiery serpents of the desert, where magic and medicine were one. We watched as early Enlightenment scientists peered through the first crude microscopes, desperately trying to bring botanical order to the chaos, trying to replace supernatural fear with empirical observation.
Yeah.
We saw the violent, desperate chemical purges of the 18th century, and now we see modern people on the internet armed with pharmaceuticals reverting back to ancient theological language to describe their gut microbiomes.
It perfectly mirrors our ongoing eternal human struggle to understand invisible illnesses, to define the concept of evil, and to grapple with our terrifying lack of total control over our own bodies and minds.
And this brings us to a final, incredibly profound concept that hovers in the background of all our sources. It provides a really powerful lens for everything we've discussed today. The Jungian concept of the shadow.
Let's explore this. Carl Jung's shadow, the unconscious, repressed, darker, more primitive aspects of the human personality. How does psychological shadow work connect to biological parasites?
Think about why parasites evoke such intense revulsion. We fear worms and parasites with a primal, visceral intensity that goes far beyond a logical fear of disease. The sources suggest we fear them so deeply because their bodies and their life cycles remind us of our own repressed, darkest nature. They represent the shadow-made flesh.
Wow.
Look at a parasitic worm. It is soft, it is vulnerable, it is blind, and it survives by mindlessly feeding on the life force or the corpses of others.
It is the embodiment of absolute, unfiltered, selfish consumption. It takes and it gives nothing back.
Exactly. When we recoil from a parasite, we're often recoiling from a mirror. We fear them because, on some deep, unconscious evolutionary level, they reflect the most basic, destructive, consuming aspects of biological life aspects that exist within us, but that our higher consciousness desperately tries to repress. Which invites a rather provocative question for you to mull over after this deep dive ends.
I know where you're going with this, and it is a heavy thought. If a parasite is clinically defined as an entity that moves in, drains resources without contributing, alters the environment exclusively for its own benefit, and mindlessly feeds on the host until the host is destroyed.
On a cosmic scale, if we look at the Earth as a giant, living host body, are humans just another type of parasite?
Wow. We started this deep dive talking about that X-ray machine. The desire for a clean diagnosis. Broken or not broken. Demon or biology. External invader or internal failure. But when you really look at the mechanics of consumption, at how life feeds on life to survive, and how our minds construct metaphors to cope with it all, the diagnostic waters aren't just muddy, they are infinitely deep.
The invisible invader is always terrifying. But sometimes the most unsettling realization isn't finding the bug, it's recognizing the traits of the invader within ourselves.
Something to think about the next time you feel something else steering the ship.